In ancient Rome, where sandals slapped stone roads and senators spent half their day adjusting togas and the other half pretending they understood Latin grammar, life was ruled not just by emperors and armies, but by some surprisingly specific, sometimes head-scratchingly odd laws, especially if you judge them by today's standards. But back then, tucked into marble temples and echoing atriums, they made perfect, if slightly peculiar, sense. Take, for example, the Roman obsession with bells. Now you may associate bells with churches, schoolyards, or that tiny handbell your great-aunt used for summoning snacks. But in Rome, particularly in the early Republic, bells, or tintinnabula, played a rather more hygienic role. Public latrines, the ancient equivalent of restroom stops, were, let's say, communal affairs. Imagine a room filled with long stone benches, delicately carved with holes. No dividers, no doors, just you, the city, and perhaps too much eye contact with strangers. Because there was no such thing as occupado signs or even the dignity of a knock, Romans instituted a rule. If a person was in the restroom, they rang a small bell placed near the door. This wasn't just to announce one's presence. It was a courtesy chime, a melodic shield to give a little sonic privacy amidst echoing tile chambers. A sort of "please imagine I'm invisible now" bell. Strangely sweet, isn't it? And that's our first clue into why the Romans made up so many strange social rules. For a society so often portrayed in bronze busts and marble majesty, they were really just a bunch of people trying not to be awkward in public. Another example, porridge, or more specifically, the Poles. If you think porridge is just a breakfast food, your grandpa complains about being too spicy. Think again. In Rome, pools was not merely food. It was practically a legal obligation for the lower classes. Under early Roman traditions, citizen soldiers were paid mostly in grain, and they were expected to survive primarily on poles, a kind of thick, soggy barley mash. But here's the twist. There were written ordinances about how much grain a citizen soldier could consume in a week. Not because Rome was stingy, but because too much pools might lead to indigestion or rebellion. You see, diets had social significance. Eating too richly was seen as potentially corrupting. There were actual laws, sumptuary laws, meant to humble excessive appetites. For instance, at one point, Roman women were forbidden from buying overly colourful clothing or being driven in elaborate chariots. Why? Because city officials were trying to prevent unnatural levels of fabulousness. Yes, they legally restrained glamour. What a world. But back to pools. This simple dish not only nourished the belly, but preserved the image of the ideal Roman citizen. Modest, hardy, and only slightly constipated. There's also the matter of spitting. Romans, like us, sometimes found themselves needing to politely evacuate the mouth region. But it wasn't just a matter of manners, it was law. In certain periods, particularly during outbreaks of disease, or when the city was especially filthy, which, let's be honest, was most of the time, it was illegal to spit in certain public spaces, temples, baths, theatres. Offenders might be fined, shamed, even scolded by toga-clad officials with scrolls and stern expressions. If you're wondering how they enforced public hygiene controls 2,000 years before multi-surface Lysol, well, they had spit spotters. Not their official title, of course, but they would have made excellent lifeguards or middle school hall monitors. And then there was silence in the streets. Certain days, often during religious rituals or official proclamations, required the city to be mostly silent, especially near sacred areas. Loud speech, heated discussions, even street musicians could be outlawed for a day. Imagine a city of 1 million people collectively whispering, just legions clanking past, pigeons, and maybe a disgruntled goat chewing papyrus in the background. The rule was fascinatingly precise. If you broke the silence, your punishment included not just a fine, but sometimes public duties like cleaning the vomitoriums. And no, despite popular misconception, vomitoriums weren't where Romans went to purge after overindulging. Those were simply exit passages in amphitheaters. But you can imagine the sanitation assignments weren't exactly rewarded with olive wreaths. All of this might sound bizarre, and it is, gloriously so. But beneath the peculiar laws was a theme: community. Even the oddest Roman rules served the Republic's larger goal: to maintain public order, decency, and functional city, living in a sprawling mess of marble, sweat, and poetry. So the next time you find yourself annoyed at modern rules, like those signs saying, "Don't microwave fish in the office," remember that an ancient Roman once rang a small brass bell just to announce they were using the public restroom, gently, respectfully. Bell in one hand, dignity in the other. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, breathe softly. Our next tale awaits just beyond the Roman aqueduct, where pigeons once defied Senate laws, and perhaps still do. In the amber-tinted afternoons of ancient Rome, where sandal straps softly flapped on dusty stone roads, and senators adjusted their togas more dramatically than was strictly necessary, rules were everywhere. From the height of your sandals to the sound of your sneeze, yes really, there was probably a Roman law regulating it. And among these many peculiar protections stood a rule about water. Not the sacred spring kind. Oh no, this was about your very practical, very unglamorous household plumbing. More precisely, water from your roof. Not even flowing, just dripping. In the age before rain gutters and municipal storm drains, the Romans had opinions, extensive ones, about what your roof was doing when it rained, because as it turns out, rainwater tumbling off a tiled roof could turn a peaceful piazza into a slippery lawsuit faster than you could say, "Veni vidi vixi." The Romans had a law called the Lex Julia de Aquis et Lucibus, translation, the Julian law concerning waters and lights, which, despite its rather magical name, was less about starlight and more about property surveys. This law ordained that you, proud owner of a charming Roman insula, could not let water pour off your eaves and directly onto the public walkway. If your terracotta roof released a steady stream onto the heads of passers-by, congratulations. Your front steps were now an unlicensed hazard, and the city could fine you, because no one likes getting surprise-soaked on their way to buy olives. And here's the twist. If your roof water happened to damage your neighbor's property, say, it seeped cunningly into their storeroom and turned prized lentils to beige porridge, you were liable for that too. Romans, for all their love of blood sport, were the original don't be a bad neighbor society. They even got specific. A section of Roman legal texts states that a house must be constructed so that water either drains onto the owner's own land or into a designated public gutter. Now, if you're thinking these kinds of rules feel oddly modern, well, you're not wrong. Ancient Rome had building codes that would make a modern city planner weep with joy, and possibly envy. In fact, before you erected anything, wall, balcony, or even just a fancy new statue of your uncle posing heroically with a goose, you had to make sure it didn't interfere with someone else's light or air, That's right, the Romans cared deeply about their sunlight. Not because they were solar powered, but because they didn't want their houses dipped into eternal shade by next door's new marble monstrosity. This was a society deeply preoccupied with fairness, or at least the appearance of it. If your domus blocked my precious sunset, I could take you to court and possibly win damages. And if your bathhouse exhaust wafted unpleasant steam into the bedroom of the lady across the street, well, may the gods help her pillowcases. The great thing about these regulations was how specific and calmly bureaucratic they were. All this in a world where gladiators were still fighting tigers and emperors named their horses senators. Civilization, it appears, isn't a straight line. It's more of a lazy river, meandering in surprising directions. And the water laws didn't stop at buildings. Even road construction came under Rome's eager eye. If you dug a ditch and allowed water to pool, where it might lurch into someone's cellar or gently corrode a granite column over time, you bet there was paperwork, complaints, and a slap on the wrist from the local aedile. Basically, a Roman city inspector with sandals and silent judgment. You can almost picture it. An aedile, arms neatly folded, peering skeptically at a puddle outside your courtyard while you explain nervously that it hasn't rained in 3 days and perhaps the gods are just having a laugh. Rainwater, shadows, goose-related statuary. Rome was deeply concerned with how your private life affected public well-being. A lesson, perhaps, in just how communal life was in a city of over 1 million people tightly tucked into multi-story apartments with very thin walls and a lot of opinions. So the next time your neighbor's faulty downspout soaks your favorite plant or your dog, remember, ancient Romans were right there with you, towel in hand, wondering if they could sue for sogginess. And speaking of neighbors and their choices, there's one Roman regulation that tiptoed ever so politely into the realm of bedtime. Imagine living in a world where even your nighttime noises were up for legal debate. But that, my dear listener, is a night story for another moonlit murmur. Imagine for a moment you're a Roman citizen, not the emperor, not even a senator with sandals polished by servants, just a humble olive oil merchant with a decent toga and a wagon with one squeaky wheel. You wake up, stretch under the weight of last night's lentil stew, and get ready to face another day in the bustling, burping metropolis of Rome. But before you even consider opening your shop, or even your eyelids fully, there's one thing you must remember. Don't you dare toss anything out your window. Because in Rome, window etiquette wasn't just polite, it was law. City living in ancient Rome came with certain dangers. Fires, riots, runaway goats with a vendetta. These were expected. But what kept many Romans truly on edge wasn't invading barbarians. It was airborne fish heads. You see, in the first few centuries of the Republic and well into the Empire, Roman cities grew upward. Apartment buildings, or insulae, became the norm, rising 5, 6, even 7 stories high. They were built quickly and creatively, if by creatively you mean with creaking wood and the structural confidence of wet paper. Living in such close quarters made privacy a myth and laundry a public spectacle. So naturally, what didn't go down your stairwell had a long way to fall, and Roman tenants, never ones to leave waste management to the imagination, had a habit of disposing of refuse via the tried and true method of opening a window and tossing it out. The resulting chaos was predictable. An unfortunate soul walking home after a long day of sharpening scrolls, suddenly baptized by a flying chamber pot. But Roman lawmakers weren't about to sit idly by while their toga hems were soiled, from the skies. And so, they passed a rule that, by today's standards, sounds rather specific, but was absolutely essential. If you flung something from an upper window and it injured or even mildly stunned an innocent pedestrian below, you were legally responsible. Not just with a stern look or a scroll of reprimand. Oh no. You were financially and, in some cases, criminally liable. Yes, ancient Rome had personal injury law, long before lawyers had decent haircuts. This concept was nestled in Roman civil law under Lex Aquilia, an ancient statute that basically said, if you hurt someone's cow or their foot or their forehead, you owe them. Over time, it adapted to life in the crowded city. Lawmakers knew that no thriving society could flourish on the whimsy of airborne lettuce stalks and expired anchovies. As a consequence, Rome became one of the first societies to require its citizens to, quite literally, look down before they let go. Some apartment blocks even hired young boys to yell warnings before someone dumped out a slop bucket. Their job? To shout things like cave canem and also falling soup. Historical records don't say exactly what they were paid, but chances are it wasn't enough. Other residents got craftier. Instead of ejecting their waste, they'd store it in ceramic pots and take it to the communal cesspools. These, rather elegantly, were collected by sanitation workers known as felons, who had the unenviable job of managing other people's smells for a living, and we complain about email. Still, the rule served a bigger purpose than keeping white togas white. It reinforced a very Roman theme, the importance of the res publica, the public thing. Roman society, for all its grandeur and gladiator drama, was glued together by laws that asked for cooperation in the name of order, even if that cooperation involved not hurling yesterday's dinner at your neighbor's skull. The rule became part of the fabric of urban life. It taught Romans to think twice, not just about waste, but about their role in a shared society. A lesson as relevant today as it was when Julius Caesar might have visited a friend and narrowly dodged a descending chicken bone. Now, as the gas lamps dim and your mental image of Roman rooftop mayhem fades gently into the background, perhaps you're wondering what other oddly specific rules these ancient city dwellers clung to. As it turns out, if you thought their anti-littering laws were peculiar, just wait until you hear what they did about fashion faux pas during election season. Now, if you happen to be walking the streets of ancient Rome sometime around, say, the 1st century BCE, you might notice many things. Sandals slapping softly on worn stone, the occasional goat nibbling unattended laundry, and an aroma that, let's be generous, was complex. But your curious eye might eventually settle on a peculiar sight. A small cart wheeling its waddling way through a forum, bearing not goods or produce, but white chalked lines, and a man behind it, marking spots with the gravity of a high priest and the flair of a sidewalk artist. What was he doing? Drawing boundaries for urination. Yes, in the grand city of marble arches and military discipline, public bathroom habits could not be left to chance. Rome, after all, valued order more than comfort, and few things threatened public order like the wrong person relieving themselves in the wrong corner of a sacred street. You see, Roman laws around where one could, or more precisely could not, relieve oneself resembled a mythical labyrinth, twisty, specific, and quite easy to violate if one wasn't paying the strictest attention. There were designated areas for such biological performances, and when those were missed or ignored, well, there were consequences. The Romans even had a curious phrase, urina publica. It sounds fancy, doesn't it? but it simply meant public urine, and like all things that become official in empires, even urine became taxable. Yes. In the 1st century CE, Emperor Vespasian decided that public urinals, metal pots set into city corners, should generate revenue, and so was born the world's least glamorous tax innovation, the P-tax, when his son, Titus, challenged the dignity of this golden stream of corruption. Vespasian reportedly held a coin to his nose and declared, "Money does not stink," a phrase that survives even today, pecunia non olet, used when someone is quietly profiting without shame. But back to our chalk-drawing cart conductor. These individuals were known as urbani, and their job, humble as it may seem, helped Roman society avoid a crisis that modern cities sometimes still struggle with. Chalk lines and public signage weren't just about cleanliness. They upheld a fragile dignity. After all, when your neighbor's home is 2 feet from yours, and your toga doesn't include pockets for privacy, someone needs to keep standards. The laws themselves were clear, if a bit poetic. It was forbidden to relieve oneself near temples, statues of the gods, or near public springs, partly out of respect, and partly because no one wants to sip flavored water. Violators might be fined, shamed, or, if the act was especially bold, required to scrub the offense away with their own hands. Now, this may sound severe, but keep in mind, the Romans rarely had private restrooms. Even the latrines, a charming row of open-air stone benches with holes cut delicately into the surface, were less rooms than social events. One could attend to nature while chatting with a neighbor, because why not optimize time? And why not install communal sponges on sticks instead of toilet paper? Rinse and share, a lesson in both hygiene and trust. But the remarkable thing is how all of this, the chalk bounds, the pea pots, the coin sniffing, was wrapped in a broader Roman virtue, decus, or a sense of honor and propriety in public life. The idea that even the most basic of human functions must be carried out with a kind of civic pride, that a properly functioning empire needed properly functioning bladders and rules to guide them. And perhaps, just perhaps, Vespasian smiled quietly to himself every time he saw a full pot and knew it meant one more coin clinking into the treasury, funding roads, aqueducts, and maybe a statue of Jupiter that would one day be very annoyed at receiving splashback. So next time you pass a no public urination sign, remember it's just an echo of Rome, a civilization where the rules of personal urgency were written in chalk and dignity. Now, as the Roman lamps flicker low and the sandals settle silently against threshold stones, let us take a few more steps into the soft corners of this unusual empire, where laws stretched as far as the imagination, and sometimes as far as the nearest latrine. In the violet stillness of a Roman twilight, when the wine was just lukewarm enough to be disappointing, and sandals squeaked gently with each dusty footstep, there existed a very peculiar law concerning, of all things, chairs. Not the plush, velvety kind that invite a nap, but the hard, utilitarian Roman curule seat, which resembled an X-shaped folding stool more than a throne. And oh, it had rules. You see, back in ancient Rome, where power was displayed as extravagantly as a senator's eyebrows, the type of seat you perched upon was a matter of status, legality, and occasionally scandal. The curule chair, ivory inlaid, stiff in attitude, was officially reserved for magistrates, consuls, and other high-ranking officials whose egos required both external support and ceremonial seating. It was illegal, mind you, quite literally forbidden under certain juristic codes, for ordinary citizens to sit in such a chair. The chair itself had no backrest, which seemed appropriate. There was no leaning into power here. If you were going to officiate a court matter, command an army, or argue the finer points of marble taxation, you would do so with excellent posture. And yet, why enforce such a rule? Why prevent a cobbler, exhausted from a day of sandals and sore backs, from sinking gratefully into a little ivory stool? Well, the Romans were nothing if not obsessed with appearances. Status had to be visible from halfway down the forum. Imagine showing up at the market and having to squint at someone's tunic hem to determine whether they could sentence you to exile. Far better to assign everyone their own very public furniture policy. The curule seat was thus a badge of honor, but also a legal distinction, a line in the sand. You either held imperium, the right to command, or you held stew, and only one of those came with chair privileges. There's an excellent tale, relayed by the rather excitable historian Pliny the Elder, about a provincial governor who tried to bring his folding curule chair on vacation. Yes, vacation. He plopped it out in the middle of a public bathhouse in Pompeii and calmly attempted to officiate an argument between two tubbers squabbling over water temperature. This caused widespread sputtering. Locals were horrified. The chair had entered a non-governing space. It was, they claimed, an overreach, the equivalent of showing up to a toga party in full triumphal regalia with a scribe behind you. Impolite, and more importantly, illegal. The governor was reprimanded by the Senate, who issued a stern letter suggesting that even imperial furniture needed a holiday. Perhaps more astonishing than the laws themselves was the Roman passion for enforcement. If you weren't entitled to sit in a curule chair and were caught teetering on its sacred frame, well, you might face a fine, an official scolding, or at minimum, the sharp end of a poet's satirical verse, which, in ancient Rome, hurt quite a lot. And yet, underneath all this oddly specific chair, governance lay a surprisingly thoughtful motivation. These kinds of laws, bizarre as they look now, helped maintain order in a city where social escalation was possible, but delicate. The furniture wasn't just wood and ivory, it was a line of communication. Imagine trying to rise through the ranks, only to discover someone had planted themselves in your future career's footstool. Unacceptable. Even in times of political chaos, when emperors changed more frequently than a well-fed newborn, the curule seat remained a signal. This is who holds power. Sure, it's amusing now. We chuckle at the image of toga-clad men being legally restricted from having a proper sit. But back then, it was all part of the choreography, the strange ballet of law and image that kept the unwieldy Roman Republic from tipping off the stage completely. And so, if you'd wandered the streets of Rome and seen someone balancing awkwardly on a collapsible stool with all the visual comfort of a cheese grater, you might not just see a man. You'd see law, you'd see authority, and you'd see a civilization so deeply structured it could assign morality to upholstery. Speaking of structure, there was another rule that kept order with surprising effectiveness. This one involving the use of fire. Not the destructive kind, but the cozy, late-night kitchen kind. By the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic had an impressive knack for micromanagement. Not of spreadsheets or workplace emails, mind you, but of morality, beans, and how much purple a person could legally wear. Let's settle deeper into our creaky marble daybed and unfold the crisp scroll of another curious Roman rule. The sumptuary laws, ancient legislation with a flair for the dramatic and a downright obsession with limiting luxury. For the sake of the Republic, of course. Now, sumptuary laws were essentially legal party poopers. They told you what you could eat, wear, and spend, not to protect your wallet, exactly, but to protect the moral fiber of society. And nothing says moral fiber like limiting how many geese you're allowed to serve at dinner. The idea was noble, if not a little dreamy. The Romans feared that unchecked indulgence would lead to decadence, and decadence, according to every stern senator with a bushy eyebrow, would bring about the fall of Rome, or at least really unpleasant dinner parties. Take, for instance, the Lex Oppia, passed in 215 BCE, in the middle of the Second Punic War. Faced with the terrifying brilliance of Hannibal and his war elephants, the Romans decided the best tactical response was to stop women from wearing colourful dresses. The law forbade women from possessing more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicoloured garments, or riding in carriages within the city, unless heading to a religious festival. Because naturally, society is best defended in muted tones. Understandably, this led to some frustration from the fashion-forward matrons of Rome. In 195 BCE, a spectacular protest unfolded. Roman women, in droves, filled the streets around the Forum, persuading their husbands to repeal the law. The Senate, ever composed and rational, was scandalized, but relented. Perhaps they'd learned the hard way that when Rome's women say they want color back in their wardrobes, you hand them the dyes. But the Lex Oppia was just the beginning of a long, restless relationship between the state and private indulgence. Over time, lawmakers would pass increasingly elaborate restrictions. There were rules against too many musicians at your banquet, bans on serving wild boar more than once a week, and even detailed linen-to-citizen ratios for tablecloths. An unenforceable but oddly specific law that likely haunted at least one textile merchant's dreams. One particularly dramatic attempt to rein in excess was the Lex Fania of 161 BCE. This charming bit of legislation dictated how many guests you could have at a meal and how much you could spend on dinner. On ordinary days, 100 asses was the limit. That's a Roman monetary unit, not an unfortunate livestock tax, though I see how your mind might wander there. On festival days, you could go as high as 300 asses, which still won't get you a really good amphora of wine. So keen were they to prevent wasteful feasting that the Senate even put inspectors, called aediles, in charge of party patrol duties. These morally upright buzzkills would stroll through homes, especially those of the political elite, sniffing for extravagant delicacies and counting gladiators like naughty hors d'oeuvres. Truly, imagine trying to smuggle an illegal pheasant under your tunic while pretending it's just a very lumpy toga accessory. And yet, in typical human fashion, people found ways around it. Secret feasts were held behind closed doors. Chefs grew ever wittier, disguising expensive ingredients in humble wrappings. Ostrich tongues were minced to look like lentils and jellyfish, somehow a Roman delicacy, might be very politely disguised as salad. This culinary cat-and-mouse game turned the kitchens of the wealthy into something between an art studio and a criminal hideout. As decades passed, emperors tried and failed to revive sumptuary zeal. Julius Caesar, for instance, once banned the use of expensive litters, those cushioned platforms carried by slaves, unless you were a priest or already fabulously famous. Nero naturally reversed most restrictions, replacing them with a new law mandating that everything must sparkle. And at the heart of it all was Rome's eternal tug-of-war between simplicity and extravagance, between rugged virtue and imported silk. Every rule scribbled into a law scroll about dining limits or shoulder embroidery was, in essence, an attempt to tame the unruly splendor of empire. Funny, isn't it, that a civilization capable of spanning continents and building aqueducts was still deeply worried about whether its citizens were garnishing their oysters inappropriately. So if you've ever eaten one too many cookies while promising moderation, know this: you're simply continuing a grand Roman tradition, complicated, hypocritical, and faintly cinnamon-scented. Now, turn your gaze toward the flickering oil lamp by the wall. There's another rule, just as peculiar, still tucked inside the bustle of old Roman life, waiting patiently in the shadows of the city's crowded streets, by the sleepy rustle of Roman togas and the gentle clink of amphorae in the distance. Tonight we find ourselves in the midst of one of ancient Rome's more whimsically noble attempts at societal order: sumptuary laws. A term that sounds like a mixture of sumptuous and a sneeze. Sumptuary laws were Rome's attempt to keep people from showing off just how fabulously wealthy they were, unless, of course, they had the right connections and an imperial eyebrow of approval. Imagine this: you're sitting in your modest domus, a small baked tile roof overhead, maybe a couple of half-broken terracotta figurines lounging in the atrium like sleepy cats. Next door, your slightly richer neighbor Gaius has just ordered his third purple-trimmed toga. Not the whole toga dyed purple, no. That would be an act of pure madness. In Rome, only emperors could wear the full royal purple. Tyrian purple, from snail secretions far too costly and stinky to discuss before bed. You, however, are still expected to look nice, civilized, respectable, but not too nice. Rome liked order, and that included the appearance of class distinctions. Enter the lex oppia, one of the most endearingly controlling of Rome's sumptuary laws. Picture this: year 215 BCE, amid the chaos of the Second Punic War. Hannibal's elephants are tromping their way through Italy, and the Senate is looking for ways to conserve both gold and gravitas. The lex oppia restricts women from possessing more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored garments, or riding in carriages through the city, unless it was a holy day. Now, you might wonder, why were lawmakers fixated on women's gold weights and riding habits in the middle of wartime? Well, think of it as Rome's version of please think about the troops. The logic went, if the ladies of Rome were showing restraint in their fashion choices, it would inspire national humility. This, of course, didn't stop Rome from shelling out extraordinary sums for naval reconstruction. But priorities are what they are. The lex oppia remained in place for about 2 decades. As the war wound down, the Roman ladies became increasingly, let's say, expressive about their desire to reclaim their adornments. In one of history's softest rebellions, groups of Roman women took to the forum, not with pitchforks, but with passionate persuasion. Senators were intercepted on their way to assemblies, their togas respectfully tugged, their ears sweetly lobbied. It worked. The law was repealed in 195 BCE. The reformers were victorious, and pearls and purple trimmings could once more clink and shimmer across the city. Not all men were thrilled. Historian Livy, in fact, somewhat dramatically records one senator lamenting that Roman women could not endure equality and wanted to dominate. Which is, frankly, the sort of thing one says when someone else's earrings are shinier and you've had a bad day at the Senate. Still, Rome didn't abandon its fashion police spirit entirely. Later laws attempted to limit the size of funerals, the number of guests at banquets, and the amount one could spend on seafood. Yes, even oysters could become suspiciously extravagant. A truly lavish Roman dinner party might feature flamingo tongues, honey-glazed dormice, and a level of culinary creativity that sometimes wandered into gentle war crimes. But if you invited too many people, or poured too much garam sauce, the authorities might raise a censorial eyebrow. The odd thing is, well, the gentlest oddity, is that all these rules were, in some delicate way, meant to protect people from one another, to stop the wealthy from reducing everyone else to a game of "can you top this?" and to remind the growing empire that even in the face of wild inequality, dignity had limits, preferably golden half-ounce ones. In the flickering oil lamp glow of the time, it's oddly reassuring that a civilization, so legendary for its conquests and innovations, also stopped to write laws about fabric colors and funeral invites. All civilizations, it seems, have their bedtime fusses, and as the Roman night winds move softly through the palaces and porches, rustling the laurel leaves and gently tugging the purple hems of status, our story shifts again to a rule so specific, so utterly Roman, it may tickle both the scholar and the sleepy dreamer in you. If you were a Roman in the 2nd century BCE, walking down a cobbled street, trying not to trip on your own toga, there's one thing you'd have to keep in mind: never ever insult the dead. Not just out of respect, but by law. Yes, Rome had a deeply serious rule. Defictiones, or curses against the dead, were, well, deeply frowned upon. And by frowned upon, I mean punishable by more than just a stern look and a senator tesking at you. You see, Romans believed the restless dead could be very enthusiastic. If you didn't treat them with respect, they might pop back up in your general direction. And if you're imagining a toga-clad ghost wobbling through the forum muttering about disrespect, you're not far off from how Roman imaginations ran. In fact, the laws around tombs weren't only about the supernatural. They protected graves like government buildings. You could rob a temple and get a scolding, but disturb a burial and, oh dear, you were knocking on the doors of real trouble. To the Romans, the boundary between life and afterlife was not a solid wall, more like a gently swaying curtain, easy to brush aside with a strong breeze or the wrong kind of whisper. That's why Roman jurists, those early lawyers who wore sandals instead of suits, devoted actual scroll space to what you could and could not do around graveyards. You weren't allowed to plow near a tomb, build on top of it, or use it to host one of your famously rowdy Saturnalia parties. The gods wouldn't appreciate disco torches next to Aunt Flavia. And speaking of Aunt Flavia, you'd best choose your words carefully when eulogizing. Under Roman laws, particularly those concerning monumenta, you could be prosecuted for uttering falsehoods or insults about the deceased. This wasn't just social etiquette, it was legal protection. If you publicly declared that Lucius Maximus had cheated on his taxes while also cheating at dice and his 5th wife, the family could haul you off to court faster than you could say "et tu, brute." Even the inscriptions on tombs were under the watchful eye of the law. You might think that "Here lies Gaius, whose breath could scare a goat," was a cheeky send-off. But not in Rome. The lex sepulchri, the laws of the tomb, ensured that tombstones stayed solemn, respectful, and lawsuit-free. These rules created a kind of eternal ceasefire between the living and the deceased, where no one gets called names from beyond the grave. But Rome's worry over tomb-related scandal didn't end there. They even legislated against tomb poaching. Yes, tomb poaching. It sounds deliciously villainous. A black-cloaked figure sneaking around the Appian Way, armed with a chisel and moral bankruptcy. But it was a real concern. Tombs were family property, and using one without permission or worse, repurposing one for your own dearly departed cousin Publius, could land you in court and penalized. Seriously penalized. Because Romans took ancestry more seriously than an elite boarding school. Their legal system even paused time for the dead. Allow me to explain. Under Roman law, once someone was buried, their place of rest became legally untouchable. It was now res religiosae, sacred property, as if it disappeared from the world of commerce and taxes. No more buying, no more selling. Imagine if dying meant your house vanished into a parallel universe where no one could turn it into a luxury villa with a vomitorium-themed Airbnb add-on. And though generations passed, once a tomb belonged to your family, it belonged to your family forever. No taxes, no rent. Just a peaceful eternity, unless, of course, a stray goat wandered in and knocked over your funerary urn. Still, even goats feared Roman ghosts. At its heart, these strange-sounding laws served a purpose. They reminded Romans, and perhaps us sleepy listeners, that dignity endures, that harmony between past and present requires more than memory. It needs intention, a little marble, a few lines of Latin, and absolutely no breakdancing funerals. Some might say the Romans were obsessed with death, but more likely, they were just very good at setting boundaries in pottery and property law. And as the moon rises over the 7 hills of Rome, we tip our togas to the lawmakers who made sure even the dead could rest without interruption. A curious legacy, etched in stone, bound by law, and serenely quiet. Now, let's wander from the tombs and towards something a little more lively, though still amusingly regulated. Ready for a rule about Roman baths? Prepare your towel. Long before modern dress codes and workplace etiquette, the ancient Romans had already dipped their sandaled toes into the murky waters of regulating wardrobe choices, and not just for proper toga lengths or helmet plume height, but for shoes. Yes, in the wide universe of Roman legal quirks, next to laws about how many times you could cry during a funeral, seriously, they counted. There was one peculiarly passionate preoccupation: shoelaces, or rather, the recognizable lack thereof, since many Roman sandals had clever ways of staying on without a modern tie. But Romans were very concerned that your sandals said something about your class, your role in society, and quite possibly your moral character. Enter the Calceus law. A bit niche, certainly, but deeply meaningful in the way only ancient laws about shoes can be. Now, Roman citizen males, not enslaved folk, not foreigners, just the citizen men, were to wear specific kinds of footwear called calcae. These were closed-toe leather shoes that wrapped around the foot and ankle, meeting high society's expectations with neat, respectable laces. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of shiny Oxfords for your average middle management senator. But not just anyone could stroll around in a good pair of calcae. Senators, for example, were required to wear versions dyed in deep red, because apparently being irritatingly visible was an important feature of every political system in history. These red calcae had an official name, Calceus Mullius, named after the red mullet fish. That's right. Somewhere in Rome, a fish became the fashion inspiration for upper-crust footwear. And of course, if you're thinking it couldn't get more regulated, oh, but it did. You couldn't wear these shoes indoors. No, truly upright Roman citizens had to remove their outdoor footwear before entering certain sacred spaces or even private homes. Wealthy Romans even had slaves specifically assigned to carry their owner's shoes around, in case one had to make a speedy moral pivot, from outdoorsy senator to pious barefoot citizen, all with the aid of a compliant shoe bearer. Imagine that as your job title. But this wasn't mere snobbery, at least not entirely. The regulation of shoes served as a visual filing system for Roman society. If you were shoeless in public, that said something. If you wore open-toed sandals around town, you were probably a labourer or enslaved. If you sported red calceus mullius, you were either a senator, a fish connoisseur, or both. This helped avoid confusion when, say, someone shouted, "Bring me that magistrate," across the forum, and you wanted to make sure you weren't grabbing a humble cobbler by mistake. In essence, your feet told your life story before your mouth did. But here's where it gets almost sweet. This curious shoe dress code, in all its sandal-strapped glory, was also meant to subtly protect everyone. By making sure you were visually sorted into your correct social category, you were less likely to be punished for stepping out of invisible lines. It gave clarity in a society where titles mattered more than personal introductions. The laws prevented daily misunderstandings that, in Rome, could spiral into anything from a fine to a duel involving tridents and salty insults shouted across a public bath. And of course, the same legal attention was turned to women's footwear, but with even more superstitions packed in. High-status Roman women wore platform shoes, sometimes absurdly tall, to symbolize not distance from the ground, but distance from improper contact with men. With each elevated step, the implication was, "Please stay back. I'm legally unapproachable and potentially wearing 15 layers of linen under this stola." Once again, the Romans found a way to legislate dignity through fashion and ensure that no one's foot was in the wrong place, literally or metaphorically. So, next time you're slipping on a pair of loafers or lacing up your boots, picture a Roman senator squinting into the sunlight, muttering, "Is that man really wearing red shoes in this climate?" Perhaps, in some dreamy corner of the Forum Romanum, a sandal silently squeaked as a Roman citizen strutted into history, secure in the knowledge that his footwear matched his civic identity and hadn't offended Jupiter. Let your worries lace themselves, gently like a calceus at rest, as we soon slip into another realm of Roman rules. Ones that drift down from rooftops, with clay tiles, pigeons, and surprising property laws awaiting just ahead. Imagine yourself stepping softly through a Roman marketplace at dusk. The breeze is warm and smells faintly of olives, figs, and just a hint of cooked fish, a scent which, truthfully, you'd rather not investigate too closely. Terracotta tiles catch the golden light. Birds are giving one last squawk before bedtime. The empire is winding down for the day. But, among the hustle and sandals, a curious rule remains carved into the stone of Rome's legal traditions. A rule so oddly specific, so strangely bureaucratic, that it couldn't possibly have made it through centuries of change. And yet, it did. It was this. A Roman man was legally obligated not to arrange his funeral during an election year. Yes, you heard that right. Dead men could not campaign from beyond the grave. Now, this wasn't because Rome had become so democratic that even the deceased was suspected of political influence. No, it had a different origin, one that started, as many Roman complexities did, in the deep intersections of ritual, power, and the fear of overly dramatic funerals. In ancient Rome, a wealthy citizen's funeral was less about grieving and more about grandstanding. These were not somber affairs with soft harps and whispered eulogies. No, these spectacles could include elaborate processions, hired mourners wailing as if auditioning for the world's most emotional opera, and even actors wearing wax masks of ancestors, portraying the entire ancestral line like a one-man show inside a toga. You can see the issue. If someone scheduled their funeral during an election season, they might unwittingly, or perhaps quite wittingly, turn their own untimely demise into a campaign ad for their heir. "Look how noble he was in death," a citizen might murmur, wiping away a tear. "Surely his son should be consul." Rome's elders, watching with furrowed brows and ever-suspicious hearts, decided funerals were simply too emotionally persuasive to coexist alongside politics. It wasn't fair, they thought, to use death as propaganda. A man stands at the forum, giving a heartfelt speech about civic virtue, and just over there, a mourner sobs beside a parade elephant dressed in black silk. Unfair competition. Thus, laws emerged to limit when and how funerals could be performed, particularly during elections. The logic was simple. You can bury your father, pay respects, and even hire a whole orchestral ensemble of wailers, but do it after votes are cast, will you? This wasn't the only limitation on Roman mourning. Mourning periods, called luctus, were regulated like a very tightly scheduled theatre program. Widows were expected to mourn for 10 months before remarrying, because 10 months seemed reasonable for moving past both emotional grief and legal property transfers. There were even rules on how loudly one could cry in public. Professional mourners, whose jobs involved melodramatic chest beating and shouting, were known to be so effective at stirring attention that some leaders tried to ban them altogether. Not out of sensitivity, mind you, but because it made everyone else feel like they weren't grieving hard enough. "You didn't even bring a single howler to the funeral," folks might whisper. Clearly a man of no virtue. So what began as a practical concern about emotions influencing elections evolved into a web of social pressure, legal prohibition, and theatrical restriction, all carefully designed to ensure that, even in death, Romans kept their drama within approved civic bounds. One could only imagine certain senators sitting around, quills twitching as they declared, "Fine, you may cry, but only moderately and after the elections are complete." As absurd as it sounds by today's standards, there's something endearingly human about it all. These strange little laws telling people when they could mourn, how loudly, and under what political circumstances, were Rome's awkward attempts to balance public image with personal loss. Deeply serious, but also sincerely ridiculous. And as twilight stretches across the faded columns of the Forum, you might smile thinking of some poor Roman man planning his funeral between toga fittings and voting schedules, muttering to himself, "Perhaps I'll hold off on dying until December. Politics, you know." The moonlight glows soft upon the cobblestones, and as the bustle of the day fades, Rome prepares to rest, just as we prepare to uncover yet another peculiar rule tomorrow. Something about eyebrows, perhaps, or vegetables. But for now, let's drift gently deeper into the quiet folds of history. In the distant hum of ancient Roman mornings, among roosters, sandals slapping stone, and the occasional off-key singing of a wine merchant, it was once possible to be publicly shamed not for a crime of passion, nor theft, nor even poor hairstyling, but for wearing the wrong toga. Yes, as gently ridiculous as it sounds, there were distinct social rules on what you could wear in public, and stepping outside those rules could paint you as a renegade, or worse, for a Roman, unspeakably uncouth. Now, Roman togas weren't exactly forgiving garments. Imagine wrapping a full-size linen bedsheet around yourself and trying gracefully not to resemble a dropped burrito. Yet this swathe of fabric could whisper volumes about a person, social class, mood, office, or even whether they were in a particularly dramatic phase of their life. Toga candida, for instance, the bright white chalk-dusted toga, was worn by citizens running for office. They were literally chalking up points with their wardrobe. The word candidate actually comes from this toga, as those seeking a public role appeared in these gleaming white tent drapes to visually scream, "Pick me, I am brighter than your other terribly dressed options." Then there was the toga praetexta, edged with a stripe of purple, worn by magistrates and children. Yes, children, because in Rome, even 10-year-olds might wander around cloaked like mini-governors, looking profoundly serious while licking honey from their fingers, symbolizing their innocence and quirkily, their budding importance. But it wasn't just about fashion faux pas. Clothing was a social contract, so much so that if you dared wear the toga pulla, a dark-coloured toga worn during mourning, while not properly bereaved, people might look at you as though you'd brought a haunted urn to a feast. Mourning was serious style business. And speaking of purple, let us wander dreamily toward the shade of imperial ego, wrapped in a hue so rare, so resplendent, it could only be worn by emperors. Tyrian purple, more precious than gold, and made from the unfortunate innards of thousands of Mediterranean sea snails. This dye was powerful propaganda squeezed out one mollusk at a time. Naturally, only the emperor, or someone with a striking lack of survival instinct, would dare wear a full toga dipped in it. Wearing too much purple as a commoner could be seen as a statement of treason, or at very least, a strong desire to be exiled, or worse, dramatically murdered with poetic irony. But what if you were not in a mood for togas? What if, say, you were just trying to sneak a quiet glass of wine and didn't want to spend 20 minutes wrapping your body in rayon origami? Enter the tunic, the comfy, shapeless cousin of the toga. Easy to wear, existentially simple, and best of all, not likely to trip you during mid-sentence. Even tunics came with quiet rules, though. The senator's tunic had broad stripes, clavi. The equestrians had slimmer ones. The plebs wore unstriped versions. And the slaves, well, their tunics were basic, often undyed, and carried no status at all. Unless you count "do not speak unless spoken to" as a status symbol. Why all this fuss about fabric? Well, dear listener, in a society where one's name, ancestry, political rank and property were perpetually tied together like grapes in a cluster, the toga was not just garment. It was declaration, armor, a resume stitched in folds. And amusingly, it managed to keep order in ways few might expect, by forcing people into complicated fabrics that rustled like parchment in a breeze and required help to put on. Rome quietly said, "Act according to your station, or you'll be extremely uncomfortable." There was method in the madness, cozy, cumbersome ceremonial madness that ensured people could trust what they saw. Crowd of strangers, just glance at the hems and colours, and voila, you'd know who was who. Social clarity, right off the rack. And in this way, fashion laws became a silent protector of public order, a gentle but firm tapestry of expectations, sort of like a dress code, if violating it risked imprisonment instead of mild embarrassment. Now, with the warm folds of Roman linen still rustling softly in your thoughts, let's slip into a quieter rule, a more personal one, where sandals met silence and an early form of do not disturb signs was enforced by the gods themselves. By the time the Roman Republic really got into its groove, or at least its endless senatorial debates and wildly over-engineered aqueducts, the laws had reached a level of creative complexity that would impress even the most devoted bureaucrat. Some rules were grand, others were peculiar. And then there were laws involving chairs. Yes, chairs. Let us enter the twilight world of ancient Roman seating. Now, before you snuggle in too deep, imagine this: a bustling Roman marketplace, bronze glinting, figs overripe, toga corners catching in the wind. And there, amid the free men, women, and wide-eyed children, was a uniquely distinguished figure, not because of their clothes or their speech, but because they were sitting on a special kind of chair called a sella curulis. This wasn't just any old four-legged wooden situation suitable for dining or pondering. No, the sella curulis was a status symbol, a folding chair. Yes, an ancient government-issued folding chair, made of ivory and authority. Only high-ranking magistrates were permitted to sit upon it in public, an act that whispered or shouted, depending on your imagination, "I have the power to command legions and raise taxes, and also my back needs support." You see, in ancient Rome, furniture wasn't just furniture, it was messaging. Much like today, when someone reclines in a suspiciously ergonomic office chair in a video call, signaling they've achieved middle management level comfort. The Romans had codified this, but here's where it gets unexpectedly protective: the restriction on who could sit where and on what modern listeners might call chair law, helped clearly demarcate roles in society. To us, it may sound like rank snobbery, but to the Romans, it was order, predictability, layered into daily life like stone in a road. You knew who held what office, not simply by their toga's purple stripe or their wax seal, but whether they dared to plop their posterior down on the ivory folding contraption in front of you. And yet, not all sitting was created equal, nor was it always allowed. At one rather theatrical point, women in Rome were legally banned from riding in carriages or wearing too much purple, especially during wartime. The reason? Economic frugality, allegedly, but more likely, a case of moral panic and a Senate full of men terrified of female driver empowerment. Of course, Roman women pushed back, staging protests on the city streets centuries before hashtags, reminding male lawmakers that, while they may not have held public office, they certainly paid attention to policy. Speaking of positions of repose, we mustn't forget the dining habits of the elite. Roman banquets involved reclining on couches, usually propped up on the left elbow, while slurping mollusks and reciting poetry. This wasn't illegal per se, but rather deeply embedded in etiquette. But only free citizens were permitted to recline in this aristocratic fashion. Slaves and women were expected to sit upright or serve the dishes in silence, depending on their status. Upright or uptight, Rome had a seating plan for everyone. Now, if you misused a public bench, let's say dozed off in the forum mid-afternoon, there were ordinances against loitering, laws known as leges de ambulatione and stationibus, governed everything from where vendors could stand to where a goat could be tethered without disrupting civic order. That's right. Rome not only had goat parking zones, but ensured that goats, like senators, respected their social space. Walking the city itself offered up a dance of coded placement. Senators had right of way, of course, but so too did the Vestal Virgins, Rome's holy women, committed to chastity and fire maintenance, who were allowed privileges usually reserved for magistrates. They could ride in carriages through the city, a luxury unavailable to other women, and sit in places of honor at games. Sacred seating, if you will. The moral of the story: keep a flame lit for 30 years and the empire will save your seat. So an invisible latticework held the entire city together, not just with stone and mortar, but with rules about where one could stand, sit, decline a wine refill, or recline at a seafood buffet. Lovely, isn't it? Silly perhaps, but deeply telling. Roman laws, strange and structured as they were, made daily life feel predictable, even if occasionally they involved public folding chairs made from elephant tusks. Now, as twilight deepens over the cobblestones and the forum fades into silhouette, let's glide gently to our next tale, one involving Roman crows, funerals, and an early experiment in anti-haunting legislation. But for now, let's stay a moment longer in our quiet corner, among the seats saved for someone else. By the time the Roman Senate had passed a law regulating how many pleats a toga could have, 5 proper folds if you please, you'd think they were about finished with unreasonable rules. But no, they were just getting started. For when a society reaches a certain level of organization and invents lead pipes and flamingo tongue appetizers, it naturally begins to ask, what else can we make oddly specific rules about? Enter the curious Roman regulations surrounding dining furniture. Yes, truly. In the 2nd century BCE, Rome decided to address an urgent societal question. How many people can one invite to dinner before society collapses into moral chaos? The Lex Orcia, a law so obscure one might suppose it was written during a particularly dull Senate session, while half the room had indigestion, limited the number of guests a Roman citizen could invite to a dinner party. Now, at first, this might sound like a reasonable social courtesy. Say, no more than 8 dinner guests, lest things become uncouth. But of course, this is ancient Rome, and their version involved a precise arithmetic of morality and wooden couches. In the Roman triclinium, the classic 3-couch dining setup, the maximum number of people allowed on each couch was 3. This wasn't a matter of comfort, mind you. This was law. 9 guests total. A 10th guest, scandalous. 11. Practically an uprising. Why? Because, they said, large dinner parties encouraged decadent behavior, which in Rome meant excess wine, overly theatrical poetry recitations, bad impersonations of Cicero, and flirtatious drama with someone else's slave boy. Rome had priorities, and keeping its oratory trainees sober enough to quote Virgil in the morning was apparently one of them. Now, enforcing this law, there's the real wonder. Picture Roman inspectors, arms crossed like toga-clad bouncers, peering into windows and counting toes resting on banquet couches. 1, 2, 3. Wait, is that a 4th on the west couch? You, sir, are in violation of the Lex Orcia. Your goose livers are hereby confiscated. But the people, as ever, were cleverer than the laws. To get around these restrictions, wealthy Romans came up with the delightful gimmick of rotating guests. If you invited 9 people to dinner, you could tell them each to show up at different times, just in case a nosy legislator poked his head in. One left, another slipped in. It's not decadence, it's choreography. Others simply converted parts of their homes into what could be called pop-up triclinia. 3 couches here, 3 more in the garden atrium, another makeshift set in the library, right next to the bust of Minerva. By splitting up the crowd, they argued. Each gathering technically remained under the limit. A perfectly legal mosaic of mini debaucheries. And of course, the splendid hypocrisy of the Roman elite ran as rich as their imported figs. Senators who championed the Lex Orcia were often the very same ones throwing feasts with so many figs, musicians and dancing girls you'd think Bacchus himself was on the guest list. These indulgent affairs were cleverly referred to as religious observances or civic ceremonies, because nothing says piety like a 12-course seafood buffet, followed by interpretive dance about the founding of Carthage. Still, it wasn't all just an elaborate game of toga tag with the law. The underlying logic, strange though it may sound, was social stability. You see, Rome feared a widening gap between the glitteringly wealthy and the dusty sandals of the urban poor. By curbing ostentatious banquets, they hoped to discourage envy, preserve traditional values, and keep everyone, too, sleepy from reasonable quantities of mushroom stew to plot rebellion. Dinner, if modest enough, became a safety valve, and so the triclinium, with its strict 3-person couches and strategically undercooked lentils, stood as a quiet battlefield in Rome's war against extravagance. A war, as you might imagine, they lost, but not for lack of trying or counting. As the candlelight flickers across the frescoed walls of yet another modestly sized dinner party, 9 guests, 8 wine cups, and 1 philosophically inclined goose, let us drift quietly onward, toward the next peculiar Roman rule that sought to keep order. Even in the marketplace, where the fish sellers had secrets of their own, by Roman standards, you could trip over a rooftop and still be legally liable. No, not because climbing on rooftops was a common sport, though one suspects, given the toga's impractical design, there were some daring souls, but because of a crucial Roman law concerning, of all things, flying tiles. You see, in the bustling heart of Rome, houses leaned together like gossiping neighbors. Streets were narrow, roofs were loosely tiled, and gravity, ever unmerciful, did its work. Windy days sent rows of ceramic roof tiles skittering down onto helpless pedestrians. And because this happened not infrequently, the Romans, practical and prone to solving problems with a Senate decree, created a law. If a tile fell off your roof and injured someone, or more tragically flattened a merchant balancing dates and figs on her head, you, dear homeowner, were responsible. This might seem rather normal. After all, if your flower pot smashed someone's head open today, you'd likely be on the hook. But the Romans didn't stop there. They introduced a law that's delightfully known to historians as the actio deposito aut suspenso, which sounds grand in Latin but means, quite essentially, the act on things that are placed or hung. This covered anything that you dangled from your house, a rope, a sign, even the age-old Roman equivalent of a wind chime, which may have been a bit more ominous than ours, often made from bells, apotropaic charms, and occasionally the carved bits of, well, sensitive male anatomy, which worked as a good luck charm. Not your usual suburban decor, but tough times called for peculiar vibes. Anyway, if someone hung something above a public walkway, and that thing managed to fall and land on an innocent head, or even fall in a suspiciously damaging way, say nudging someone into a fruit cart, then the hanger was required to pay a fine of 10,000 sesterces. That was more than some Romans earned in a year. It was a sum big enough to build a sturdy garden wall, or hold several very comfortable banquets involving exotic fish, reclining guests, and at least one intoxicated poet. This rule made sense in a city where people lived not just horizontally, but vertically. Multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae rose precariously against the skyline, some reaching 5 or 6 floors, which in ancient Rome was the vertical equivalent of a space elevator. These structures were rapid-fire real estate, built fast, lived in faster, and occasionally crumbling under their own ambition. The roofs were often afterthoughts, more shambles than shelter, and the tiles, well, they were sort of a suggestion more than a guarantee. And so this law, the flying tile law, as we might romantically call it, was society's broom, sweeping negligence off the rooftops and straight into the courts. It wasn't just about paying a fine either. It was about public safety. A person might dodge a runaway chariot with style and flourish, but nobody looks dashing getting clobbered by terracotta. There was even a surcharge for things hung above windows that hadn't fallen yet. Just the potential danger of, say, an ill-secured amphora dangling where pedestrians walked was enough. This gave rise to one of the most practical phrases in Roman street law: remove hazardous pottery forthwith. It's possible that urban Roman citizens walked with the caution of a cat in a thunderstorm, side-eyeing every balcony, every suspiciously fluttering cloth, every clay chamber pot perched a bit too jauntily. Because yes, chamber pots were emptied from windows too. An entirely different law handled that mess. But the brilliance of this dangling above head regulation was that it underscored a key Roman truth. If you lived in society, you had a duty not to maim that society by way of household negligence. Romans prized order. If your house was slovenly enough to throw pieces of itself onto the public below, then the injured could claim damages without having to prove your guilt. The assumption was simple. If it fell from your building, it's your responsibility. Today, we have building codes, insurance, municipal citations. But there's something rather poetic and a little sleepy about imagining a toga-clad magistrate calmly doling out rooftop responsibility in the forum, scribbling quietly on a wax tablet while a greengrocer limps in with a sore head and a story involving gravity getting the last word again. And as rooftops quiet beneath the Roman moon, the tiles stilled for now by a lull in the breeze, we drift down from the heights of architecture to something closer to ground level, something perhaps a little stickier and a little sweeter. In the heart of the Roman world, where senators strutted in togas and emperors adopted their heirs like they were picking a favorite from a fruit basket, rules filled every corner of life like olive oil in a well-used amphora. And yet, tucked between the grand laws of property, citizenship, and plumbing, there existed some extraordinarily specific, occasionally peculiar regulations that governed not who ruled the empire, but who could sit where. Yes, tonight we slide rather dreamily into the cozy, cross-legged realm of sellae, curals, the official Roman chairs, and the absolutely not-so-humble politics of sitting. Now, these weren't just any chairs. A sella curalis was a folding, X-shaped ivory seat, favoured by high-ranking magistrates and impossibly self-important bureaucrats. Where you sat, or didn't sit, said more about you than your lineage or the intricacy of your toga's embroidery. In an empire of marble and ambition, the chair was the ultimate badge of honour. But here's where things get gently ridiculous in the most bureaucratic way possible. Roman law specifically mandated who had the right to be seated in public settings, or perhaps more important, who must remain standing. Magistrates, sit down, take a load off, show off that fancy ivory. Senators, go ahead, recline with gravitas. Regular citizens, you, upright champion of the common cause, try to be comfortable standing there for 6 hours listening to judiciary debates in the Forum Romanum, and don't let those legs wobble. The law said so. This wasn't arbitrary. Romans believed that sitting implied dignity, and granting dignity to just anyone was a slippery slope. Start letting bakers and blacksmiths park it during a Senate session, and next thing you know, people are asking for fair wages and clearer street signs. Dangerous stuff, truly. Even during theatrical performances, which Romans adored despite pretending not to, the seating arrangements were meticulously lawed up. That's right. Lex Julia Theatralis swooped in under Augustus and declared a careful social map of the theatre, turning watching a play into an elegant game of "Where's that senator sitting?" At the top, reserved for the elite. Down in front, commoners, sure. If they didn't mind sitting so close, they could spot the actor's stage fright. Women were shuffled into their own designated sections because nothing says unity like mandatory spatial separation. Perks for freedmen? Not many. Slaves? Well, lucky if they got to peek from behind a column. This elaborate seat sorting wasn't only about comfort or optics. The rationale for this seating legislation went much deeper, into the realm of public morality and order. Romans honestly believed that a structured audience was a peaceful audience. If everyone knew their place, there'd be no place for public brawls over better views of a pantomime. Now, did this work? Sometimes. Other times, riots broke out anyway, and chairs became airborne in the earliest forms of upper-tier protest. In fact, in 67 BCE, seating arrangements at the theatre sparked such a brawl that half of Pompeii's amphitheatre was shut down by imperial order. The entire city got grounded by the emperor, not for tax evasion, not for military sedition, but for fighting over better seats at a gladiator match. Still, there was a strange serenity in Rome's obsession with where one was allowed to plop down. It affirmed status, yes, but also gave structure in a world of chaos. Romans knew earthquakes could happen, emperors could go mad, and your neighbor could flood the alley with his personal aqueduct. But at least you knew that in the theater, row 6, seat 3 was reserved consistently for someone much, much richer than you. As night folded over the 7 hills and taverns closed with a sigh, citizens walked home on sandal-worn cobblestones, legs weary from lawful standing. But order had been maintained, and in Rome, order was sacred, even if it involved being legally required to stand for 6 hours next to a statue of Jupiter with a pigeon on its nose. And just imagine if you forgot yourself and sat in a magistrate's chair. That wasn't just a faux pas. That was a crime. You could be fined, socially exiled, or worse. Laughed out of the forum by a man in sandals who took seating deeply seriously. So tonight, as you curl into your own humble recliner, glad that bedtime isn't legislated by a toga-bound committee, let your eyelids rest to a whisper of quiet gratitude. Seating, in our world, is generally first come, first served. Though in tomorrow's Dream Drift, we'll meet another Roman rule that managed to enforce social responsibility through the meticulous management of leftover food. Yes, ancient leftovers had rules. Quite a feast for thought. Picture this. You live in ancient Rome, and today, as you fold your toga and head to the bathhouse, you remember you're not allowed to name your child Lucius Spaghettius Maximus, as tempting as that might be. Yes, even naming your child in Rome had rules, because of course it did. You see, the Romans were surprisingly structured about almost everything, including what humans could be called. Take the Trianomena, the Roman 3-name system. Every free male Roman was supposed to have a praenomen, personal name, a nomen, clan name, and a cognomen, family branch name. Think of it like having a first name, a surname, and then a nickname that got out of hand and stuck for 14 generations. It wasn't just formal, it was practically a legal requirement. This meant your name could function like your social security number, Twitter handle, and LinkedIn resume all rolled into one. But here's the fun part. They didn't have many praenomina to choose from. There were maybe a dozen commonly used ones among the elite. So yes, half the forum was named Gaius or Marcus, and they somehow managed not to constantly confuse one another, probably by narrowing their eyes suspiciously and choosing the one who owed them money. Glancing around the Senate, you'd find yourself surrounded by name twins: Marcus Tullius Cicero, Marcus Junius Brutus. Marcus really shouldn't be Hierus. And to keep things even more organized, there were laws on how names could pass through generations, like carrier pigeons made of syllables and patriarchal expectations. Freed slaves, for instance, took on the former owner's family name, creating an ever-widening family tree of names that sounded, to be frank, a bit plagiarized. But names weren't the only strange, purposeful constraint in Roman life. Let's shuffle over, soft sandals on smooth stone, to another curious category of Roman rule: the sumptuary laws. These were cheerful little decrees telling you what you could and couldn't wear, eat, or throw a lavish banquet with. Too many embroidered tunics at your dinner party. A senator might drop by to confiscate your olives. Truly, the horror. At one point, women were banned from riding in carriages within a mile of the city unless it was a holy day. Imagine explaining that one to your chariot driver. No, Appius, we walk to the forum today, unless it's Mars' birthday. Is it Mars' birthday? Check the calendar. And the calendar, let's not forget, was also Roman-controlled, full of festival days, market days, court forbidden days, and probably don't annoy Jupiter days too. Speaking of control, we should stop for a moment under the shade of a marble portico and consider how Rome handled noise, particularly the nighttime kind you'd rather not hear while sipping your lukewarm wine and dozing off under your decorative fig tree. You see, Romans issued ordinances about when wagons and carts could use the city streets. They were banned during the day to avoid congestion, meaning that all deliveries, grain, amphorae, compostably packaged scrolls, were made at night, which meant, yes, sleep-deprived Romans and the soothing lullaby of squeaky wooden wheels and donkey hooves echoing through the night. It was so regular, in fact, that the sound of creaky axles and the occasional disgruntled mule became the Roman equivalent of a bedtime playlist. Soft braying, a barrel clunking, a sleepy street vendor muttering, "Who ordered 5 crates of garum at this hour?" And you, noble dreamer of antiquity, would pull your woolen blanket up, nod gently, and wander off into slumber, only to be startled by the shriek of a seagull diving for leftover shellfish in the street gutter. Still, the rules, however archaic or asleep-defying, were all meant to preserve equilibrium, because Rome, above all, feared chaos. A society that could erupt into an impromptu riot over bread had excellent reasons to legislate everything from hairstyles to how many guests legally qualified as a modest gathering. Hint, more than 6, and the wine tax doubled. So whether it was naming your baby, driving your cart, or daring to throw a roast duck on your evening table, Rome had a rule for it. And though some seem baffling to modern minds, remember, these odd laws weren't just about order. They were about identity, about who you were, how loudly your donkey could clop, and whether your toga was approved by the Republic. As the moon rises over tiled rooftops and candlelight flickers behind lattice windows, let's now tiptoe toward one of the smallest, yet most peculiar rules in Roman daily life. Something to do with beards, bureaucracy, and the unfortunate fates of bureaucrats who forgot their razors. By the time you've wandered deep into the bureaucratic gardens of ancient Rome, you may have noticed a certain obsession with order. Everything had its category, its procedure, its official wax seal pressed by someone with a name like Publius Gaius Spreadsheeticus. And so, it should come as no surprise that, at one point, The Roman Senate took it upon themselves to regulate, with absolute gravitas, how much purple dye a man could wear. Yes, purple, the colour, the hue of grapes, emperors, and high-fashion imperial exclusivity. You might not think a wardrobe choice could rock the foundations of a civilization. But then again, you've never told a Roman senator that his toga looked a bit too purple. In Rome, colour wasn't just preference, it was power stitched into your tunic. Tyrian purple, in particular, was basically liquid prestige. Extracted painstakingly from thousands of tiny sea snails, one drop at a time, it was a dye so difficult to produce, it was quite literally worth more than its weight in gold. Convenient, since most people wearing it were probably already carrying gold, or being carried on litters by people who had never even seen gold. Now, to prevent this pigment-powered inflation of egos, the Romans introduced a law known as the sumptuary laws, a set of regulations telling citizens what they could and could not wear, depending on their station. Want a toga trimmed in the deepest, most royal purple? You'd better be a senator, an emperor, or someone bold enough to feign being either, which came with legal complications. Imagine being a humble merchant who had a very good quarter, imported some spiced garum sauce from Hispania, made a tidy profit, and thought, you know what, I'm going to treat myself to a new tunic with a slightly more regal flourish. Bad idea. The ediles, Rome's city officials responsible for public order and fashion police duties, yes, really, might have stopped you right there. Wearing more than your allocated amount of purple was not just gauche, it bordered on treason. A little too much radiance in your threads, and you'd be mistaken for someone with the power to raise legions or dispute Senate roll call. But here's where it becomes even more delightfully Roman. The exact amount of purple you were allowed to wear was, naturally, subject to debate. Was the hemline too thick? Was the shade bordering on imperial? Did it shimmer too sassily in the moonlight? These were real legal questions. Court cases might hinge on the number of snail-crushed threads in your collar. Senators argued, quite soberly, over chromatic thresholds as if discussing treaties. It wasn't just to preserve the dignity of the elite, though of course that was a very large part of it. The rule also functioned as a visual code, a kind of living infographic. One could tell at a glance who was who amidst the crowded forum or the bustling baths. A person in modest earth tones may have been a hard-working farmer or scribe, while someone in luminous robes edged with purple may have been a consul or a man with excellent connections and a lot of snail's blood on his conscience. And like all laws concerning things that sparkle, people found ways around them. There were smuggled dyes, hidden linings, cloaks that sparkled suspiciously in lamplight, but were flipped inside out when an aedile roamed past. It was fashion espionage, Roman style. Underground dye makers would take orders through grapevine networks. Word-of-mouth transactions hushed and covert as the trade of illicit scrolls. Even emperors were not exempt from purple drama. Nero, ever the extravagant performance artist, took his purple obsession to Baroque levels, cloaking not just himself, but even decorating animals and buildings with it. At one of his more decadent dinner parties, he allegedly dyed the water in the fountains purple, an act simultaneously stunning and utterly impractical, considering how many mollusks had to sacrifice their lives for the party. Yet, despite the overuse by some, the rules held strong, not because the people feared the consequences, though penalties could be severe, but because they truly believed in the symbolism. Purple was not just expensive, It was sacred, a color consecrated by tradition, by law, and by the collective agreement that not everyone needed to shine alike. So, next time you see a royal robe or a lavender scarf fluttering in the breeze, think of the Roman who wore a dull brown cloak with pride, content to let emperors stain themselves in purple, while he quietly filed taxes and obeyed toga thickness regulations to the millimeter. And speaking of quiet regulations, we'll now wander over to something arguably even more peculiar: how Roman fireplaces, or lack thereof, literally shaped their sense of privacy, culinary standards, and, with remarkable stubbornness, their living room layouts. If you were a Roman homeowner, and let's dream that you were, resting on a cushioned lounge in the atrium with a fig in one hand and a lazy greyhound curled up by your sandal, you'd have to be extremely careful about one very important thing: the roof over your neighbor's head, or more precisely, anything that might fall off yours and land on theirs. In the Eternal City, where walls were shared and space was an eternal negotiation, the Romans cooked up a rule so oddly specific that it sounds like something out of a slapstick scroll. They made it illegal to store anything precariously on the edge of your rooftop, just in case it fell off and conked a passerby, perhaps a senator on his way to scold the forum pigeons. This may sound like an overly cautious ordinance, but here's the thing. When much of your architecture relies on flat roofs, clay pots, drying laundry, and the frequent temptation to keep a spare amphora of olive oil just up there for now, the danger was not imaginary. So Rome had what we might call today a don't be a roof nuisance law. Officially, it might have fallen under property and delict law. Unofficially, it was the city's way of saying, if your flower pot takes out a fruit vendor, that's on you. The roots of these laws lived within the famous 12 Tables, Rome's earliest code, kind of like the Roman equivalent of programming patch notes. New in Scroll Update 2.3. Defenestration now considered rude. These ancient legal codes reflect more than just civic caution. They hint at a world constantly navigating the proximity of other people. The Roman insulae, those tall tenement blocks where most citizens lived stacked like lasagna, could be as tall as 6 or 7 stories. And let's just say, plumbing wasn't what you'd call state-of-the-art. So the idea of things dropping from above wasn't theoretical. It was Tuesday. And if something did fall and harm someone, the legal system was surprisingly pro-plaintiff. Roman jurists developed a delightful concept called actio depositis et suspensis. Translation: the lawsuit of things hung or placed. Not exactly poetic, but extremely practical. This law allowed any citizen to bring a claim against a neighbor who carelessly placed stuff in a way that might injure someone, or actually did. It didn't even require damage to have already occurred. For instance, if you were just walking along the street and noticed your upstairs neighbor had strung up a suspiciously large chunk of marble on a bit of twine, you could ask them to take it down before it joined the city's gravity-inspired collection of street hazards. Fines were stiff, 3 times the damages in some versions of the law. Justice in Rome may have been blind, but it was positively paranoid about head injuries. Now, what defines suspiciously placed? That was the art. Roman law often left room for argument, which might explain why so many Romans took up law as a career, or at least a lively dinner table debate topic. One can imagine 2 toga-clad men gesturing wildly as they argued whether a leaking vessel of stew counted as a suspended peril, or merely an enthusiastic soup. The deeper charm of this odd little rule lies in its combination of absurdity and wisdom. It speaks of a society so densely constructed, so full of bumping elbows and shared stairwells that what sat on your windowsill or roof truly mattered to others' well-being. In a culture that gave the world legal contracts, aqueducts, and public baths, it also gave us neighborhood safety warnings, Roman edition. It's humbling, really. Here was a civilization that birthed emperors and engineers, yet couldn't ignore the danger of a wobbly chamber pot. Logic, law, and the everyday tangoed endlessly in Rome, much like they do now, only with fewer sandals. As night deepens and you picture those old rooftops fading beneath a velvet sky, imagine the quiet victories of those ancient citizens who, thanks to a curiously specific law or two, walked home a little safer, perhaps even whistling under the moonlight uncracked by falling wash basins. And as we drift from rooftops to other slightly smellier corners of Roman regulation, don't worry. There's always more oddness tucked within the scrolls. Not all Roman laws were etched in stone for grand matters of war and politics. In fact, some were carved straight from the oddities of daily life, like socks on a rooster, or laws about when not to sneeze during business deals. One such delightfully mundane yet surprisingly vital rule was the Roman obsession with termini. Not the bustling rail stations of modern Italy, but the sacred border stones. Yes, stones, rocks, markers in the dirt. And you're about to discover how seriously the Romans took them. Now, imagine ancient Rome, a patchwork of farms and estates sewn together like a toga, by land disputes just waiting to happen. That tree is on my side, claims Marcus. Actually, it's my fig tree, replies Aulus. Violence almost ensues. Enter the hero, Terminus, the Roman god of boundaries. Terminus, not exactly the most dramatic figure in the pantheon, was essentially a divine rock, or rather, he was embodied in boundary stones marked with his image or name. Once a terminus was placed, it could never be moved, ever. Not even the emperor could budge it. These squat little rocks had more legal clout than Julius Caesar on a bad hair day. Every February 23rd, Romans celebrated the festival of Terminalia, during which neighbors would come together to garland their shared boundary marker with flowers, pour out wine or honey, and offer up a lamb or pig. Sometimes all three, because what says neighborly cooperation more than standing in a field together, holding drinks, and thanking a rock so you don't end up in a decade-long property feud. This wasn't just a nice bit of tradition, it was legally enforceable. Moving a terminus was effectively land theft, and deeply sacrilegious too. It was believed that disturbing one invited Terminus's divine anger, which, while unlikely to involve lightning bolts, could result in an alarming number of goats mysteriously falling ill. If Romans suspected a terminus had been shifted, they could take the matter to court. Witnesses would be summoned, possibly local farmers with opinions stronger than their wine. Then, the boundary would be redrawn based on testimony, and often the stone re-sanctified, because nothing settles neighborly disputes like an official re-rocking of fields. And lest you think this was all just hyperbole, consider this. When King Tarquin the Proud tried to move a terminus during his massive urban beautification campaign, his attempt at turning Rome into an ancient architectural Pinterest board, the stone, according to legend, refused to budge. Builders heaved, oxen strained. The terminus stayed. The people whispered that this was a sign. Terminus, god of boundaries, would not yield, even to kings. Rome, they decided, must always be ruled by law, rocks before royals. Romans placed such supreme importance on clear borders and their stubborn little deities because land was wealth, wealth was power, and disputes were as rampant as geese in the forum. The terminus system, oddly poetic for a society famed for gladiators and stone toilets, was a peaceful answer to the complex arithmetic of human greed, a kind of divine accounting department with a taste for livestock offerings. But there was something charming in it too, the idea that peace among neighbors could be preserved not just by law, but by ritual, by the shared belief that a sacred stone in the soil was more than mineral. It was memory, proof that once 2 people stood there, shook hands, drank wine from oddly shaped cups, and said, "Let this be the line between mine and thine." A surprisingly gentle concept from the same civilization that invented crucifixion. And so, night after night, these little rocks slumbered in the fields beneath moonlight and pomegranate trees, guarding the invisible lines that held Rome together, one plot of stubborn earth at a time. Soon, we'll explore another curiously specific rule, one that governed not borders, but the very beans on your ballot. Yes, beans. But for now, let the idea of sacred rocks and neighborly feasts lull you into a restful pause. After all, even boundary stones need a little dreams of their own. Some Roman laws were written not just with ink, but with the invisible ink of exasperation. Take, if you will, the astonishingly specific Roman rule that addressed the issue of overly enthusiastic mourners at funerals. You see, ancient Roman funerals could be downright theatrical. Professional mourners, yes, people who were paid to weep, lined up alongside grieving relatives to let loose performances so dramatic that even modern soap operas would ask them to tone it down. The louder and more chaotic the mourning, the more prestigious the deceased appeared to be. So naturally, affluent Romans began competing not just in life but in death, hiring more mourners, louder singers, and even actors to reenact their glorious life stories. At one point, this deathly theatre evolved into such a full-blown sensory event that processions blocked traffic, terrified livestock, and annoyed the respectable populace trying to enjoy a quiet glass of wine in the forum. So the Senate stepped in, because of course, nothing says civilization like legislating grief. One law firmly limited the number of professional mourners you could employ. No more than 10 women were to be hired to wail, claw at their faces, and recite verses of deep despair. The slapping of chests was permitted, but only up to a reasonable decibel. Tearing of garments, acceptable. Tearing of hairstyles, now regulated. Excessive self-scratching, highly discouraged. The law aimed to preserve public order, reduce traffic disturbances, and perhaps most importantly, bring funerals back from Broadway levels of production. Now, why did this matter to Rome? Well, because funerals weren't just private family affairs. They were public displays of wealth, honor, and lineage. Allowing unchecked dramatics was effectively giving aristocrats another way to gloat beyond the confines of the grave. The law curbed an inflationary grief economy that made the less wealthy feel pressure to put on a grief performance they simply couldn't afford. And truly, there's nothing more exhausting than competitive sorrow. Speaking of ancient performances, we tiptoe now to another delightful decree: the ban on fire swallowers and animal tricksters in the early Roman Forum. Yes, the archaeologically infamous center of public life sometimes resembled a medieval street fair. Hawkers sold grilled dormice and fermented fish paste, while acrobats did cartwheels dangerously close to high-ranking toga wearers. A particularly vexing issue involved street performers who entertained with monkeys dressed as senators. And while toga-clad monkeys might sound adorable to us, to Roman elites, this was the equivalent of political satire in sandal form. So regulations were passed, Animals could no longer be dressed in togas, though sandals were still fair game. Furthermore, jesters could not recite verses about politicians within 20 feet of the rostra, the official speaker's platform, lest the crowd get the wrong idea and start agreeing with them. This regulation cleverly avoided full censorship while upholding decorum, or at least what passed for decorum in a civilization where dinner parties included live eels swimming in decorative fountains. On the topic of dinner parties, let us not forget the rules surrounding reclining. Yes, ancient Roman banquets involved lounging, usually on one side, arranged in a horseshoe shape known as a triclinium, Greek for we do not believe in chairs. A rule was passed at one point stating precisely how many people could recline per couch. 3 was the upper limit, any more, and it was considered grossus or tacky. Someone tried to squeeze in a 4th. That was uncouth, borderline treasonous to a trained Roman eye. The reason? To retain elegance, allow the host's servants to reach the wine cups with grace, and to prevent guests from poking each other in the nostrils while reaching for olives, a frequent hazard of over-reclining. It was all about balance, physical, political, and softly feline in its reclining etiquette. And while that may sound like aristocratic fussiness, it served a larger function, structure. In a society obsessed with symbolism, order at the dinner table echoed the greater harmony of the state. Even at rest, Rome sought alignment. So as you drift your own way into a reclining position tonight, picture a hill of villas above the Tiber, where mourners are sobbing within regulated key changes. Monkeys sulk wistfully out of their confiscated togas, and dinner guests maintain a lovely triangle formation, all for the great cause of civic order. What a civilization! And whispering just beyond, gleaming through the papyrus of time, another rather peculiar law awaits, a rule involving pigs, property lines, and one truly unfortunate wedding. Let us drift now into the solemn beauty of Roman calendar law, a topic so thrillingly sleepy, it could put an insomniac chicken to sleep. And yet, beneath its fog of dusty-sounding dates and high-minded holidays, we find one of Rome's most charmingly bureaucratic oddities, the ancient ritual of when exactly you were allowed to conduct official business, and when the calendar itself told you to quit it and go home. You see, the Romans, despite their reputation for disciplined legions and strategic genius, were hilariously superstitious when it came to timekeeping. The Roman calendar wasn't just a handy system for telling you when your cousin's toga party was. It was imbued with laws about what you could and couldn't do on any given day. Imagine a calendar where every date came with instructions. Some days were marked with an F for dies fasti. On those days, magistrates could conduct public business, lawsuits, punishment declarations, and whatnot. Other days bore a N for dies nefasti. No lawsuits allowed, no public decisions, absolutely no yelling at senators, even if they took your seat at the baths. And then there were NP days, short for nefastus publicus, which sounds a bit like the name of an ancient Roman villain. These were days of elaborate public festivals. No court cases, no legal action, and not even a papyrus push. Only feasting, parades, and weary goats decorated in gold paint, wearing tiny laurels on their horns. Probably. To the Romans, this wasn't frivolity. It was divine order. Time was not a flat, endless line of interchangeable Tuesdays. Time had texture. Some days were sacred. Others were safe for arguing. It was as if the gods themselves were the cosmic administrative assistants of the Republic, determining who gets to sue whom on which Thursday. This calendar was originally under the strict control of the pontiffs, the Roman religious elite. For centuries, the priests were the ultimate schedulers. They alone knew which days were fasty and which weren't. And they didn't always share that information conveniently. That way, if a senator had a court date looming, the priest could simply declare the day nefastus and, "Oh dear, what a shame, Augustus. Your prosecution of that extortion case will have to wait until next month, or next year, or never." It was like weaponized Outlook calendaring. But eventually, in what surely felt like the most anticlimactic revolt of all time, the Roman people grew tired of being denied their legal rights purely based on some priest forgetting to flip the celestial desk calendar. So in the year 304 BCE, a clerk named Gnaeus Flavius spilled the beans and revealed the pontiff's secret scheduling system to the public. He published the Fasti, the official calendar, in the Roman Forum for all to see. The people were thrilled. Imagine being told your entire life that time was the mysterious domain of robe-clad incantation mumblers. And then suddenly, boom, there it is in black and white marble. Now your cousin can finally sue his landlord for fraudulent rental of a haunted insula. This may seem like bureaucratic fluff, but it had real-world consequences. The calendar gave ordinary Romans some predictability. Without it, a powerful person could simply declare your trial date to fall on a forbidden moment in cosmic time. With civic calendars publicly posted, these holy dodges became harder to pull off. In the world of ancient Rome, knowing what date it was and what could happen on that date gave you power, or at least the comforting illusion of control. Like jotting due taxes in your planner and then ignoring it for 8 consecutive weeks. And then there were the comitialis days, when the public could vote. These weren't just regular weekdays. They were democratic unicorns. Not every day was worthy of an election. Only the gods knew why Tuesday was acceptable for passing laws, but Wednesday, too spiritually itchy. The Romans even scheduled time off, not because people were stressed, but because their calendar demanded it. It commanded rest. Courthouses closed. No arguing. Absolutely no yelling about dowries today. It's the day of Feronia, goddess of marketplaces and travel snacks. And so, their lives quietly pulsed to the rhythm of not just seasons and shadows, but permissions. A society that conquered gaudy swaths of the known world was still completely, quite rigidly, beholden to a stone slab covered in letters and lunar guesses. As the moon lifts a little higher over the 7 hills of our sleepy memory, allow your mind to soften into the idea that time itself, once upon an empire, was ruled by ritual. Which days to speak, which days to be still. Next, we'll peek into the curious Roman logic behind a law that required your father's permission to do just about anything, even after you turn 40. Oh yes, it only gets more obedient from here. As the twilight of Roman legality softly descended upon another sleepless edict, let us tiptoe quietly into one of the empire's oddest little rules. One involving the humble toga, a bit of mild hypocrisy, and a ban on being too fashionable. Yes, dear listener, the Romans not only built roads and republics, but also regulations about how fabulous one could look on the street. Imagine it. You've just stepped out of your domus in the Subura district, your sandals tightly laced, your toga draped just so. You feel a light breeze of pride. You look marvelous. But then, a whisper of dread. What if you look too marvelous? That was a legitimate worry for some Romans, thanks to a fascinating law that might as well have been called the Anti-Overdressing Act. About 18 BCE, Emperor Augustus sat in his polished marble lair and decided that Roman morals were in decline. People were marrying too little, dressing too extravagantly, and, gasp, forgetting the sacred importance of reproducing good Roman citizens. So being Augustus, he whipped out a few conveniently timed moral reforms, collectively called the Leges Juliae, or Julian laws, which sound very romantic, but were, in fact, something close to early imperial micromanagement. One of these reforms, tucked somewhere between edicts on marriage behavior and inheritance perks, tried to curb excessive displays of wealth. The logic, if you're paying attention, was that over-the-top clothing encouraged not only vanity, but sometimes scandalous behavior, like attending dinner parties in east-facing silk, revealing not just your shoulders, but also your Oriental trade connections. Monstrous. So Roman citizens, especially senators and the upper echelons, were expected to wear the toga, a garment which, humorously enough, was nearly impossible to wear correctly without appearing tangled in your own formal wear like a cooperative burrito. But that was the point. The toga was sober, cumbersome, and showed you were serious about civilization. Lavish adornments, brightly colored tunics, and imported textiles were frowned upon, particularly for men. Women had a bit more color allowance, but even they had limits. Too much gold thread, and you might as well be auditioning for a position as an ill-famed temptress, or worse, a mime actress. There was even a mild suspicion surrounding men who wore soft, brightly dyed clothing. Suetonius gossiped that Emperor Caligula favored silk robes and long sleeves, which may be the ancient equivalent of saying he wore a sequined bathrobe to the State of the Union. Fashion regulation reached a quiet crescendo under the empire's elite when senators were explicitly prohibited from wearing purple except in small strips. This was to avoid the tension-filled situation of multiple men showing up to the forum in rival shades of imperial grape sorbet. Only the emperor got full use of the color purple, a hue so rare it required thousands of mollusks sacrificed just to dye a few inches of cloth. This made purple not just a color, but an act of economic warfare. Wear too much of it, and people might think you had ambitions. And if history has taught us anything, it's that having ambitions in Rome was often followed shortly by having an accident in the bathhouse. Now, despite these curious limitations, vanity found a way. There were always those with trick seams in their tunics or secret golden threads embroidered discreetly between the folds. And let's not forget the footnotes of history. Rome's high-octane gossip. It was an art form. If you wore an unusually polished belt buckle, someone's uncle would whisper about your motives at the public latrine. Still, for all the pomp and prudence, the rules did encourage a kind of collective equality, or at least the illusion of it. On the surface, a rich man and a moderately less rich man could stand next to each other in the forum, both awkwardly swaddled in togas like reluctant parents at a school play, and debate Cicero without their clothing betraying exactly how many villas each of them owned. Clothing, you see, was not purely sartorial in Rome, it was constitutional, a subtle code wrapped in 20 feet of wool. And so, as the lamps dim across the Palatine Hill, and the murmurs of yet another Senate debate sputter into the breeze, the anti-fashion laws stand not as outright silliness, but as solemn attempts to stitch modesty into public life, one stubborn toga pleat at a time. Let's fold those thoughts away gently, like the edge of a senator's hem at the end of a long day. Because up ahead, there's one more rule that managed to rope animals into Roman lawmaking with, shall we say, dramatically hilarious consequences, Among the more curious Roman laws, nestled between the rules about toga colours and obligatory public baths, was one that regulated ceilings. Yes, ceilings. Specifically, their height. Because in Republican Rome, even your living room needed to mind its head. You see, as Rome's neighbourhood swelled with bodies and ambition, apartments called insulae rose like tipsy layer cakes of clay and timber. Designed more for height than for stability, many of these buildings were over-enthusiastic vertical experiments. Think of them as ancient inner-city high-rises, just with more mice and fewer elevators. Or, well, zero elevators. These insulae were often packed, families crammed into spaces the size of well-behaved closets, while business owners rented the street-level floors to hawk bread, garum, and the occasional questionable public poetry. So what does this have to do with ceilings? Well, Roman officials, who imagined themselves part city planner, part philosopher king, decided that regulating the maximum height of buildings was the surefire way to stop pedestrian squashing collapses. Only they didn't stop there. They also issued rules about minimum ceiling height. That's right. Even if your rent was equivalent to 3 amphorae of rotten olives, your landlord was still technically not allowed to make you crouch. Some scholars say rooms had to be at least 10 Roman feet high, which is roughly 3 meters or about the length of a tall gladiator lying down. Not the most scientific unit of measurement, but rather effective as a visual. Now why, you might wonder? Would an civilization so consumed with conquering the Mediterranean also worry that your apartment should allow you to fully exhale? Well, the Romans, pragmatic as they were fond of sandals, believed that health began with the air that must be able to circulate, rise, and escape, especially when your building happens to be heated with smoky charcoal braziers and your hygiene routine involves oil and scraping tools more than actual water. A proper ceiling, they believed, prevented disease, fire, and the general calamity of bad smells accumulating in an awkward domestic fog. Of course, as with most Roman regulations, the law was enthusiastically passed, modestly enforced, and creatively evaded. Some landlords simply ignored the rule. Others claimed that the tenants in question, being shorter than average citizens, or in some cases goats, didn't need more vertical space. And then there were the landlords, who simply built ceiling optical illusions, adding upward angled beams or painting frescoes with little cherubs floating over fake arches to give a sense of heavenly airiness, even when your head and the rafters were becoming extremely well acquainted. But ceiling edicts didn't end in the household. Oh no, the Romans legislated public spaces just as vigorously. The Senate decreed minimum clearances for archways, doorways, and even triumphal parades. After all, what good is a glorious procession if your conquering general gets beheaded by a low arch while riding his 4-horse chariot? Triumphant logistics were vital. It's hard to shout Veni, Vidi, Vici with dramatic flair if your ceremonial laurels are tangled in a lintel. And as anyone who's ever tried to carry a tall couch through a small door knows, ancient Roman statue bearers probably had a few choice Latin sighs. Still, for every properly ventilated room, there were buildings constructed slightly taller or tighter than was legal. Rome grew and groaned beneath the weight of its own codes, sometimes ignoring them altogether, other times fervently citing them, especially if it meant a political rival's building project got slapped with a fine or demolished. In the most poetic twist, the Emperor Augustus himself, eager to make Rome marble where once it was mud, enforced the building code with renewed vigor. He limited insulae heights to 70 Roman feet, a silently stern way of suggesting, please don't crush the citizens you just conquered. So there you have it. In a world of gods, emperors, and military campaigns, at least someone was thinking about where the ceiling should stop. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? That even as Rome spiraled into empire, someone cared whether your bedroom was breathable. And maybe, just maybe, that's one more reminder that civilization isn't only measured in monuments, but in the space above your pillow. Just beyond those quiet ceilings, another rule awaits. One that involves public scandals, sacred chickens, and the timing of your haircut. But that's only if you're still awake. By the time the sun dipped behind the marble horizon of Rome, casting long shadows over tiled roofs and weary sandals, the city exhaled. And there, tucked between statues of stoic gods and bakeries still warm with the scent of bread, were rules. So many rules. Some were complicated, others contradictory, but a few were simply charming in their absurdity. One such rule, the Roman law that stated, if an animal committed manslaughter, it had to stand trial. Yes, you heard me. A donkey that kicked too hard, straight to court. A piglet that tripped a senator, legal consequences. While today that would sound like the fever dream of a bureaucrat drunk on wine and civil codes, back in the Republic, it was meant in total seriousness. The process was fully procedural. The animal in question, even if thoroughly unaware it had done anything untoward, would be brought before a magistrate. Witnesses would share testimonies, and the verdict could range anywhere from relocation to, rather ominously, execution. A goat once allegedly knocked a child into a stream, and the goat was sentenced to death by clubbing. One must deeply admire a society that applied capital punishment to livestock with the same gravitas as they did to human citizens. Now you might wonder, was this sheer cruelty or a warped sense of justice? Surprisingly, the answer is neither. Romans were firm believers in the sacred harmony of law and order, what they called mos maiorum, the traditions of the ancestors. When something died, especially unnaturally, it risked tattering the metaphysical fabric between the living world and the gods. So when an animal killed, it wasn't just bodily harm. It was bad omens, gory portents, spiritual hiccups. To try the creature in court was bizarrely a way of putting the cosmos back in balance. A trial didn't just penalize, it purified. Like burning sage, just with more togas and slightly more confusion. Mind you, this wasn't limited to animals. In extreme cases, inanimate objects could be metaphorically dragged into court. Yes, you could theoretically sue a roof tile if it fell and caused fatal injury. And if its guilt was proven, the tile, or sometimes the entire house, might be symbolically exiled, tossed out of the city like a bad boyfriend with poor posture, or, in some instances, destroyed outright. One might say the Romans pioneered the concept of object liability. Centuries before, lawyers figured out how to blame a toaster for starting a fire in modern apartments. But perhaps one of the more quietly delightful courtroom curiosities was the Roman concept of interdiction. If a person was deemed irresponsible with their finances, too generous, too reckless, or too generous while being incredibly reckless, they could be legally forbidden from managing their own estate. Suddenly, this wasn't just about donkeys in court or haunted clay pots. This was about people who cared too much or too little, or happened to throw too many lavish dinner parties featuring olives carved into ornamental hedgehogs. Their friends or family could intervene, petitioning the praetor with allegations that boiled down to, Julius cannot be trusted with coin. He bought a life-size marble dolphin for no reason. Please stop him. If found guilty, the accused would lose control of their assets. Essentially, imperial-era financial babysitting. This law existed not to shame but to protect. Rome understood that, between the wine and the ego, sometimes the proudest citizens needed saving from themselves. And so, while the city glistened in the grandeur of aqueducts and oratory, its oddball rules hummed softly underneath, like a lullaby of imperfection wrapped in age scrolls. They weren't perfect laws, nor always fair, but they were deeply human, which is, ironically, what made even a trial for a goose feel oddly endearing. Logic knotted up with ceremony, superstition tucked beneath the folds of law, and an empire always trying, however awkwardly, to be just. So now, as the torchlight fades along the Via Appia and Roman echoes grow faint beneath your dreams, take comfort in this sleepy wisdom. Even the mightiest empires needed bedtime boundaries. Even the grandest rulers had to sit through arguments about who let their mule wander into the Senate. Even Rome, eternal and dramatic, had rules that were more nap-worthy than noteworthy. And on that note, drift gently, dear listener. Let the clamour of the forum grow faint. Let the sandals stop marching, and let the laws take the night off. Tomorrow will bring fresh scrolls and sillier rules. But for now, sleep. You've earned it. Good night. From the curiously reasonable heart of Rome.